Very happy to have everybody joining us today. I'm wearing a Better Together shirt, and it's something that we believe very strongly in. And there's so much opportunity for growth and improvement, and that's what the conversation is about today. Dr. Vic Uzumeri has put a lot of time and effort and research into what he's going to be presenting. And this has been a conversation already, and we're just happy to welcome you guys into the conversation. And we want to invite you to continue the conversation with us after this event. And I'll be dropping some things into the chat and offering some information for how you can continue connecting and engaging. And as we wrap up at the end, I'll also be giving some information about an event 2 weeks from now, where we'll really have an opportunity to go deep into Q&A. If you do have any questions during the event today, please drop them into the chat and we'll have them to review. We may be able to answer some questions right at the end as well, but we're looking forward to an event on the 1st to be able to really address the industry concerns and answer all the tough questions that may come to mind as you hear what's being presented today. But it's my pleasure, absolute. And I'm Linda Goetze. I'm Executive Vice President of DFM Data Core. So my apologies for not introducing myself first, but it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Vic Uzumeri. He is a recovering academic, is the term that always comes to mind when I think of him, but in part that is a very minor description of what he has done in supply chain. He's a professor emeritus from Auburn University and comes with a strong depth of experience that I'm sure he'll give you some insights into today. And also happy to have Joe Lynch, who you all may know from the Logistics of Logistics podcast. He has been interviewing leaders in the industry for quite a while, and his podcasts are some of the ones I enjoy the most in the industry. Very insightful, and he has a great way of bringing things just down to the real nuts and bolts and helping us all kind of level set. So I'm happy to turn this over to Dr. Vic and Joe to carry the conversation forward, and I'll tag back in at the end.
Well, I'll let Joe start.
Well, first off, thank you so much, Linda, for the kind words, and Vic and all the DFM people for letting me participate. My first exposure to this was I talked to Linda and Michael Darden, and Michael was on my podcast not so long ago, and I was really fascinated by what you guys are doing. I think it's long overdue. And it's funny, when the first time you guys described the problem to me, I go, oh my God, yes, why didn't I think of this? And I think as Vic goes through this today, we're all going to have that. And I think my role is to be the guy who says, I don't understand, and ask the dumb questions, which I'm exceptionally good at.
Yeah, we've had a couple of sessions, Joe. You're not that good at it. Sorry, I hate to break it to you. Should I just roll?
Yes.
Okay. This is a presentation. I'm going to go through what amounts to a PowerPoint, animated PowerPoint slides, and try to go through them, I think, probably fairly quickly, because as a recovering academic, I'm capable of boring anyone to death if I'm given a chance. So I'm going to try and move through quickly, and hopefully that will leave quite a bit of time at the end or in the middle for Joe to prod with questions or clarifications, but hopefully certainly at the end to leave a good chunk of time for, if anyone from the audience wants to ask questions, we can dig deeper into different aspects. So let me start and roll. This is a grand tour. If it's Tuesday, we must be in Belgium, covering a lot of territory. And it really comes down to the question of how do we know what's going on in digital freight matching at an industry scale. Companies know what they're doing individually. Shippers know their loads. DFMs know what they're trying to put together. But how does the industry know what is actually going on? Or more to the point, does it? And so I think that's the topic, and to look at the state of the art and to think about what we could change. Really, what's the minimal change we could make that would make a big difference and might help everyone in a significant way. So there we go. If we think about cloud, I mean, everybody wants to have a marketplace. Everybody wants to match trucks and loads, especially empty capacity on trucks with loads, and loads want to match with trucks that are going to the right place and all that kind of stuff. First thing that comes to mind is, well, let's have a cloud marketplace for truckload assignment. Yay. If that's the case, then you start with a shipper who's got a load to be sent. You've got an online marketplace. Marketplace is visible to a whole bunch of interested carriers. They respond. They may ask questions. There may be some more dialogue. Eventually, one is the contracted carrier, and the contracted carrier takes the load to the destination. And this is, I think, anybody walking in with the idea of how would we do digital freight matching? How would we have a digital marketplace? This is probably what's in their, a naive user walking in, this would be what's in their mind. Well, this must exist, because after all, we're fairly familiar with its existence. I've got a little, there we go. We're fairly familiar with its existence in some other contexts, because that's basically exactly what happens in eBay, Airbnb, Uber, and countless others. So why don't we have this in trucking? And if not, why not? So part of the reason, I suspect, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and everybody will have their own opinion. The ones that stand out to me is that we have a lot of players in the digital freight matching market. A lot of people are coming to digitization from a lot of different places. So all of the usual suspects, shippers, carriers, 3PLs, brokers, are all buying software, building software, and attempting to get into the market and becoming the marketplace. There are dedicated marketplaces, not necessarily coming from a history, but nonetheless are software and systems that are trying to provide solutions that will solve the problem. And then we have sort of a whole bunch of miscellaneous tech solutions. And I'm sure right now every PhD student at every major university is looking at, I can start a company to do something in this space. And some very big companies are doing the same thing. So we have a very mixed up. We've got DFM Data Corp has been assembling a database directory of actors in this game, and we're up somewhere around, we're in the 700s right now. So the problem that creates is that, in contrast to the market, the simple cloud marketplace we're used to in other contexts, what we have right now is a whole bunch of different cloud marketplaces. And each of them are independent. Some are big, some small, everything in between. And not only that, but we have a number of marketplaces and a number of supporting services that are actually taking things like listings off of one load board and transmitting it through an API or something else to another load board. This all happens outside the view of the shipper, or may happen outside the view of the shipper. And there are other people that are even grabbing stuff off various load boards and putting them on other load boards that are almost off the grid for pretty much everybody. The idea is to get the loads out in front of the people who have the trucks, and somehow or other this is all going to sort out. This is a much more complex world than the simple marketplace that we see so successfully in other areas.
Yeah, if I could just jump in real quick,
yeah.
Is what you just described there before we get to the problem is that sounds great. If I'm a shipper, I'm like, hey, I want everybody and their brother to know about my loads. So far it's like, yeah, bring it on. I want everyone to know about my loads. I think you're going to talk about the problem in a minute, though.
Well, that's exactly correct. I mean, these things don't happen by accident. They happen because people perceive a reason to do it. Right. And so if we have this many players all in the game and all thinking that they're believing that they have the solution, then it's because they see pieces of it that make them think that. The problem is when you look at it as a whole system, and that's the whole market. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of spot loads. These are particularly focused on the spot market. Spot loads a day going in the United States. That's a huge impact on our economic behavior. It ought to run as well or smoothly as possible. But there are at least three big problems that I think are notable. The first is that all of that confused data, having all of those listings, which are duplicates and maybe out of date. First of all, it distorts supply and demand. How many loads are really available today? And well, better question is how many unique loads, how many of those loads are actually not the same being repeated? If you don't know that, then it's very hard to determine what supply and demand really are. And we pretty much come to rely on supply and demand as the basis for figuring out what a market price should be. So if we don't know supply and demand, then you got to ask the question, how do we know what our market price should be? So that's one problem. The second, of course, is that all of that confused data wastes time and money for everybody involved. People are chasing loads that no longer exist and chasing trucks that have now been booked and they don't know. So there's a lot of wasted time and effort. And a last point I'll make, I'm not so sure about this, but I have it. I won't say it keeps me up at night, but if you have this many players with this much data and this much confusion, boy, we've seen some pretty nasty stuff happen in cybercrime. I wonder whether this isn't, how strong, secure this is against problems that might occur, not so much at breaking into an individual marketplace, but what would happen if you could pit one marketplace against another or do some other kinds of games. I'll leave that for now, and I don't want to go into it too deeply at this stage. But.
So the problem, it comes, if I'm following you right, Vic, and I'm pretty sure I am, is that my load, I'm the shipper. I want my load. I want everybody and their brother to take it. And I don't mind that somebody else put it on another place. But after a carrier is selected, the broker said, or the DFM said, yes, we booked that load, and that trucking company is on the way to pick it up. There's still that load on a whole bunch of load boards because I didn't take it off. I mean, the shipper, it's beyond their control at that point.
Well, it varies. Like everything else in this great big space, everything varies. For example, if the loads were put out there by some of the better TMS systems, they will actually go and clean up their loads. They'll clean up after themselves. But then if loads are put out there by mom and pop operations or people who are maybe not as experienced or knowledgeable, they could leave them up there to confuse everybody for a little while longer until people just give up.
Yeah, and so I've seen this in just in the bullpen where the load board is up there and you say, hey, and I was at a trucking company, and I would say, hey, there's a truck from Detroit to Atlanta, or a load from Detroit to Atlanta, and that's what we're looking for. And then someone say, no, that's gone. So we can do it. We can do it kind of just.
We've been doing it manually. Humans can read tea leaves. So human brokers have been figuring these things out and looking for warning signs and red flags. They've been doing that for eons.
Right.
The problem is if we try to fully automate it, because the computers aren't that smart.
Right. And by the way, Vic, that's also was pretty inconvenient because what ends up happening was you're looking for a truck, and I can say this from put my 3PL hat on for a while. You're looking for a truck, you're calling everybody and their brother, or posting on load boards. It's so when it finally does, you do finally get a truck, you're like, whew, on to the next problem. And then you get all these people still responding to this on a load board, this from an email
you would like to book the truck and then not have to field any more phone calls,
right.
or emails. But that's not the way it's not. I don't want to pick on one particular company or anything like that. this is inherent in the structure of the system as
Right.
it currently exists, especially with a mixture of human brokerage operations, various kinds of different flavors of digitized freight matching that don't talk to one another. That we have a problem where, it hasn't seemed probably like a big problem. There's no scale on this, it's just conceptual, but I think people agree with it, is that the digital freight matchers were in yellow. They were a small piece initially, and everything was manual brokers. So nobody was really, it was an annoyance, but not really a big deal. But as the digital freight matching grows, and it will grow further, as this problem, as their role increases, this problem is really likely to get worse. The analogy I'd use is when I go back quite a ways. When I first started with email, spam was actually amusing. Then it became annoying. And now if we didn't have absolutely world-class spam filters, email would no longer be of any practical value. But it is, because we built the systems to keep it clean. One fear I have is that the digital freight matching data in the digital freight matching, these spurious loads, this missing data, is the logistics equivalent of spam, and it will only get worse.
Yeah. And Vic, if I could throw one other thing in there, this whole industry, everybody and their brothers wants to say, we have all this data and we're doing all sorts of analytics, and we're creating more data from this data. And if you say, hey, some of it's just broken, it's stuff that shouldn't have been in there. That's a ghost load. That's phantom data. I'm putting garbage into my beautiful system.
Yeah, I mean, big data does not work well with garbage.
Yes.
I mean, it will do amazing things with decent data, but we don't, how do we get that in this industry? And what I'm proposing or offering here is actually a surprisingly simple solution, or simple contribution to a solution to make a lot of this problem go away. And it comes with it starts with the observation that when we're looking at the sort of the life cycle of a shipment, you've got stuff that happens in the shipper. Then there's a phase of search and negotiate. That's the digital freight matching activity, and the digitization and the brokerage activities and everything else related to it. You finally lock in on a contract, carriers booked, load built, and then you go into the transport phase where the goods are actually shipped. Right now, we don't typically lock down the identification, the identity of the load until the beginning of the transport phase. The problem is we really need to lock down its identity at the beginning of the search and negotiation phase. I mean, if you think about it, when you're trying to find the loads, when you're trying to figure out where the stuff should go, that's where most of the money, not where it's spent, but where it's decided in the logistics cycle. And right now, we don't actually have a defined name for that load until we start the transport cycle, when really all the costs are pretty much baked in. So if we're going to do a lot of digitization, the key, and this is the whole point of this presentation, we need to lock in the identity of the load before we start the negotiation cycle.
Right.
And
before you go to that, Vic, one of the things I would say is, when it's in the current system, everybody gave it a unique identifier when it was awarded to them. So there's all the 700 players you described. They all said, yes, now that has a unique identifier. The problem is, what you're describing is all the garbage that is the problem is up front of that. I
Right.
have all those ghost loads sitting out there because nobody knows that Detroit to Atlanta was already moving.
There's a
Still on
load
boards.
listed on one board. There's another load listed on another board. And it may, if it got there through sort of some convoluted process, there may be literally no physical way to tell one to know that they're the same load.
So
It may
today,
not be possible.
yeah. So as today, I have a unique identifier. I just have it too late. I have it when it's been awarded.
That's the entirety of this presentation. That's it in a nutshell. Let's get our unique identifier a little earlier in the process, and a lot of bad stuff will go away, and a lot of good stuff would be teed up, ready to happen. That's it. That's the whole presentation.
There's one quick note from my buddy Piyush, professor down at Florida Gulf Coast. He says, as a shipper, when I create a unique identifier, I'm committing that I have a load that I need to move. Would this not reduce my negotiation leverage?
No, not if that identifier is what I'm going to show you is if we disguise it so that it's not meaningful. It just is an identifier. It means that you can tell. Well, if you bear with me, it'll become clearer, I think.
We'll get to you, Piyush.
But it's a real good question. The inspiration I'm taking a little bit is from the airline booking industry. They have something called the booking reference or the booking ID. Now, I think previously, Joe, I suggested this went across all airlines. It doesn't, but each airline will have a booking reference of this kind, typically 6 characters. And with that booking reference, they tie everything about your itinerary, flights, the airlines you're going to go to, the hotels, rental cars, everything hangs off that identifier. It's framed when you form the booking. Now, that's a little later than I'm suggesting in the shipping cycle, but it's real early in the travel cycle. And even if different airlines they may have their part, may have their own booking, they have a direct cross-reference. They have them linked up so that it might change in the way, but it's the same booking. And it's the same identification. The identity is kept visible and defined through the entire cycle. I mean, you go around the world and everything will be linked together because it's known to be the same itinerary. That's really what I'm suggesting we want to try to approach in the trucking industry. Get that out there when it's in the middle of the negotiation cycle. So now everyone if you have the TUIDs associated.
What is TUID?
Transportation Unit Identifier, or we're making names up, and that's one that if anybody wants to argue strongly, we should change.
It's the unique identifier.
It's the unique identifier
that you're
it's the
advocating
name.
For.
Okay, if you have the TUID and you put it out there and it's associated with all of the listings, then what's going to happen is you'll contract with a carrier. And because those TUI, it is now physically possible. Doesn't mean it'll happen, but is now at least physically conceivable that you could go and remove all of the other listings, because you would know they are the same listing because they have the same unique identifier.
Right. And again, when we move to digital freight matching, there will be nobody in a bullpen saying, ignore that already moved. that should have been deleted. There is no.
You have to replace that smart broker with a digitized computer software system that will accomplish the same goal.
Right.
And there's no way that I can see to do it unless you've put a unique identifier on that load wherever it is posted, the same one. So then you can take it off.
So is the shipper the one who creates the unique identifier?
It has to start there because the shipper is the one who conceives of the fact that that a load is a load. Nobody else knows. Not during the negotiation phase. During the negotiation phase, the only one who knows is the shipper. So they have to be that has to be where it starts. So how do we create a transport unit identifier, a unique ID? There are about a million ways. I'm going to suggest one fairly simple way, and it has the advantage that It could be done totally independently and unilaterally. We don't need a centralized system. We don't need a TUID god to hand out numbers. If you use an approach like this, anyone can do it. And it basically says take numbers or information that's already available. In this case, for example, just so we can nail down the country, we use the telephone country code. You have to make a little adjustment for USA, Canada, but that's not hard. You want to get the company, the shipper's company. How about their tax ID number? Nobody else is supposed to have the same one. And then if you have it pinned down to that, if the company can maintain a system internally so that every load is unique, and that might happen in their SAP system, might happen in their TMS, it might happen in an Excel spreadsheet, whatever. If they do that in those three pieces, there's no way that you should ever see another load anywhere that has exactly that information. So just put them together, pack them together as text, and then apply something called a hash. And the purpose of the hash doesn't change anything. Purpose of the hash is to disguise. I mean, you don't necessarily, back to the professor's question, do I really want my information out there? Do I want to share that information? The answer is if you don't, then run it through a hash, and hashes are very widely used. If you take a hash, it has two characteristics that I think make it really attractive. First, almost every programming language has built-in software to compute these. I mean, usually you can do them in one line of code. The second, and this is the really powerful part, is that most computer systems store their passwords as hashes. Matter of fact, if you run across a computer system that doesn't, my suggestion is run screaming from the room. And the reason they do is that hashes have a property where if they match, then the inputs that were used to create them must be identical. But you can't use a hash. You can't use that long number and work backwards to the inputs that produced it. Or at least you can, but it takes about the same number of calculations as there are atoms in the universe. So most people consider it impractical. That's the kind of something like that. And that's why it's used in virtually every software system as the basis for storing passwords. We could use something that accessible and that commonly used, and just simply say that. It's a little long, and we can maybe tweak it and do some engineering on it and make it shorter and easier to read. But the basic point is that long string can be computed by a shipper without reference to anyone else, and there'd be absolute certainty that no one else would ever generate the same one. And then if you stick that as the, give you an idea how something might like that might work, a shipper could keep an account or a listing of their own profile information, who they're going to send it to, or who should get the TUID, and create what I would call a TUID generator. So when they get a shipment, they would apply whatever's their own flavor of internal shipment ID. Doesn't matter what it is, because it won't match anyone else's, even if it's the same system, because the country code and the EINs are different. So take that information, run it through the generator, and now you can send the TUID to a recipient. That might be very useful when they're trying to track stuff in order to cache. You can put it into some kind of a data lake so that there's a record that you considered it to be authentic or real. You put it in the marketplace, carrier can pull it down. You can give it to factors. Maybe the insurance companies want to know it.
Vic, you guys are recommending that we create an industry standard
Yes.
to create that TUID, and that's the unique identifier. So we're going to need everybody. We're going to need a critical mass at some point. And I think you're going to talk about that. You're going to need a critical mass to say, let's do it this way.
Well,
we'll get on the same page.
The key thing here is you can start this process. I mean, I could start putting a TUID on it. If I were running a factory, I would simply follow the standard to create a TUID and put it on all the documentation that I send out. Wouldn't hurt anything. It'd actually be sort of useful because I'd be there to make sure there was never any confusion on my part. And I don't need anyone else to do it. This particular approach does not require anyone else to cooperate in order to generate and send out the TUID. How it gets used is where the cooperation is required. And if we want to think of great ways to use the TUID, now we have to bring the industry together. So, but the core idea of generating it is totally self-sufficient and standalone and requires no other, not beholden or responsible to anyone else. Does that?
Got it. Yep.
Use it or don't use it. It's your choice. But imagine if we did it, and if we had that means that everyone in the industry can plan, ship, and reconcile with everyone else because they could actually say that they were talking about the same load.
Right.
With certainty. And every shipment would be properly identified and could not be confused with any other.
Right. And sometimes and I haven't looked at it lately, and I haven't run across this lately, but every once in a while when I'll get back to an Excel spreadsheet where somebody says, I need these 10 shipments, or you'd see 10 shipments that would be going from Detroit to LA, to LA, and there would be no unique identity. And you go, oh, okay. And then when you see them on load boards, you don't know if they loaded each one individually or if it was.
Well, we've talked to some brokers for convenience.
List it once.
They just list the fact that they've got 10 loads a week going from Chicago, from one place in Chicago to one place in Miami.
Right.
And they're only worried about finding 10 trucks.
Yeah.
They don't even try to distinguish which load is on which truck.
Yeah. And when I talked to Michael about this on my podcast, we talked about this killing ghost loads and phantom data, because that's what's out there right now. We have, which again, we can manage as people. We don't want to, but we do, right? We say that is junk, that one already moved.
Well, which load came into my dock today? Was that the third load this week or was that the fourth load? How do I know? I mean, you get on the phone and you ask the questions and you have a lot of back and forth, and then eventually you figure it out. But that's all wasted time.
A lot of wasted time.
It doesn't need, and if every load, which basically means every truckload, every contents of a trailer that came through your dock had a TUID that was different from any other. And if it was a hash thing, it wouldn't mean anything. It would exist and it was different. If you had that, then you could say, look, I mean, I got this one with this TUID. Oh, that was the fifth one. Where's the fourth one? I mean, when you talking back to the shipper, I mean, you have conversation that is far more meaningful. And what does it cost? This is peanuts. So that's the basic idea, is to create a unique identifier before the shipment search and negotiation and digital freight matching cycle. And then it's available. Use it or don't use it, but it at least exists. So that's basically just like the airlines. You got a number you can track back to. And you know that, I mean, that number, that code, AGM, that's one person on one itinerary. That's no one else. And there can be no confusion. So that's basically the idea, is to set up the same thing in the trucking industry.
Yep. And right now, if you kind of to apply the problem to go back to that Airline example, all of those guys have, that's one plane. So I know all those seats. What we have in effect is that imagine if I said, oh yeah, that we're trying to do it with 10 different planes, right? We've made these, in our business, we have everybody kind of working separately. The good news for the British Airlines is they got one plane that's going from JFK to Heathrow, right, on that day and that at that time. So they have that advantage. We need to get ourselves that advantage, which is getting, a standard.
Yes. And this is actually, if you look at this example, the name on there is Donald Hogle. I have no idea whether, I'm hoping he's fictitious. But that's him. That's his itinerary. If he changes his itinerary, or something, or he doesn't fly, somebody else takes a seat, they'll have a different number. There'll be no possibility of confusing their itinerary, their journey with him.
The airlines are a pain in the ass, but at least when you get to your seat, usually there's not somebody sitting in it.
Look at the services that they're piggybacking on top of the flight. Look at all the things that are now linked. I mean, it takes me 10 minutes to book a flight just to go through all the options. All of those are only possible because that itinerary is unambiguously identified.
Yeah.
And think of all the things that could be done in trucking, all of the other services that could be created around if we could actually tell which truckloads were which truckloads. So that's the basic premise. If we want to move on to how we would get there, I mean, the next section I'm going to go through quickly. It's actually, there's so many aspects to this that I think we've talked about. Maybe we really will do another podcast just on these parts, but I'll go through it quickly because you need to look at these to understand how we might take that idea and actually get it implemented, or at least some ideas for it. In order to implement it, I think there are 4 generally plausible scenarios. The first scenario is how some standards like this do get implemented. And that's that one digital freight management organization will take over the entire US spot trucking market. Their internal systems will have the unique identifier. That will be it. There'll be no problem at all.
Amazon can't do that.
Well, we have 750 players in our directory, which means that one will be really happy and 749 are going to be really sad. I'm not sure that that's a scenario that I mean, just the odds are most people in the industry who are looking at those odds would probably not be happy. Now, there's a few companies that may actually aspire to have the whole thing. But then again, there's some other forces at work that might be less than happy if that were to happen. So, but physically, that's one way to solve the problem. And it does happen in many industries where, in fact, the de facto standard emerges because there's one dominant player. That could be the result. The second is that we could have industry associations come together and do a kumbaya, and they all work together. The only problem with that I see is that there's some mechanics to this. You have to build stuff and make it work. And I'm not so sure I know how a bunch of industry associations how good they are at building systems. But they could surprise. Third option, which is what I think will almost certainly happen someday, if we don't find a solution in the industry, is to clean this up. If everybody can't do it, it'll fall back on the government. The government will finally will have to step in.
Yeah, like
they may not want to, but they'll have no choice.
We'll get king for a day, but it'll last a little longer than that.
Well, I don't think anybody wants this solution, but how long will we allow this kind of confusion to exist in a marketplace that's so critical to the entire North American economy?
What we've learned during the pandemic, unfortunately, is how dependent we are on supply chains and how fragile they are. And you talk about what's happened on the West Coast or just disruptions due to illness. And I mean, we're lucky that it works remarkably well, but I think the government probably is looking and saying, this is a national security issue.
And that will be the I don't want to say pretext. That'll probably be the reason. And
if you
I'm
don't
not
give
sure I
us
can
our
argue with
food, we're a hungry group. If you don't give us our food, it's like taking our cable away.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the third option. The fourth option is to build, and this is very similar to what happened in the airline industry. You create an industry-owned and governed utility. That's an organization. It's a private corporation. We have the same thing with that a lot earlier. I mean, the old railroads were like that in some ways. Then Georgia Power and the electric utilities. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have 55 of them. So you have one, but they operate under a defined mission and limited rules, and they're not trying to rape and pillage the entire industry. They're there to provide a necessary service. Actually, a good model is something that's been in the news a lot, and that's Colonial Pipeline. That's where it transports gas from the Gulf Coast up the Eastern Seaboard. It's owned by 10 of the big oil companies. They're all shareholders.
So that's what I'm guessing. You're not advocating the first three. You're going to advocate this fourth one.
This is the one that we're talking. This is the one that DFM Data Corp is specifically focused on building. How to get an industry-owned and governed utility. And you got to get there from here. So it's got some staging problems and challenges, but that's basically where we feel if we could get to there, you would have a vehicle to do all these things and maybe a number of related stuff that would be very valuable. But it would be this would be done by the industry for the industry, not imposed from outside, and not subject to the total dictatorship of, say, a single dominant company.
And the collaboration, Vic, the collaboration with the industry associations. I mean, DFM is a member of CSCMP. You know, we have carried the conversation into these associations, which is very, very important, in my opinion, as we provide a utility for the industry, is to have that collaborative industry collective association.
You could put the industry-owned and governed utility under the sponsorship and the guidance of the industry associations. Perfect. Nothing wrong with that. That's a great point, Linda. You know, there's different ways to play around with it. You could have perhaps some productive involvement by the government in sanction. You know, there's some hybrid possibilities, and all of those should be explored if they'll lead to good things.
So when you say industry owned, right now it's not industry owned. It's owned by a group that's trying to get the industry owned. Is that correct?
No, I don't. I think it's just the ownership. Any of this activity is so diverse and so balkanized and spread out that I don't know that anybody can claim ownership of anything in any practical sense.
Right. Well, when it says industry owned and governed utility, that's your goal, is to say, let's get a whole bunch of industry leaders all involved here and have them have that ownership.
But more important, we have to give them the framework, the infrastructure.
Yes.
The pieces necessary. And the key to that is something like a governance model where the member companies vote on a steering committee. I mean, you might call it a board of directors. So companies join. In this case, I mean, there's a number of ways to do it. We've actually put a structure together where companies join by getting equity in the company, which means they have an ownership stake in the company as well as the voting rights for the boards of directors.
Right. If they got skin in the game, they're going to want to make sure this works. They get skin in the game,
and they have legal standing with that skin in the game. They then, member companies and the steering committees create working groups to tackle specific problems. The working groups propose ideas. They vote on recommendations. They go back to the steering committee or the board of directors. And the board of directors vote on and send it to we need to have an operating company. Something can actually turn turn the bolts and pull out the wrenches and write the software. But that is totally subservient to the steering committee, or the aka board of directors. And the steering committee would have control of all the aspects of this, including things like the fees charged, the subscriptions, the money would actually be determined by the steering committee. The problem is, how do you build this when you don't have it as a starting point? There is no steering committee to build the steering committee until you got a steering committee. So
I'm going to jump in on that one too, because we actually had the chairman of the steering committee on the call here as one of the attendees, and John Greaves, who many in the industry might be aware of. He actually owns the patent for RFID in manufacturing and has been a standards body leader across multiple organizations that are global, like GS1, IEEE. He's come on board and has worked with people like Dr. Denise McCurdy, who has her doctorate in blockchain governance. And we had a blockchain question earlier here as well. We can address some of those questions later as well. But this is something that we have been laying the framework for. And myself and Jeff Hurley are also members of the steering committee, but my job is to help get the industry leaders on board to the point that they take my job. I don't want to be on the steering committee long term. I want it to be run by the members of the industry. That's necessary. That's appropriate. That's why we're doing what we're doing, to be able to create that structure that no individual company that has a stake in the game, so to speak, really would have the right to create this infrastructure. We're not trying to take the role of a dynamic freight matching company. We're not trying to be a TMS provider. We're trying to provide the infrastructure to enable the community to communicate with each other and do it using these foundational pieces of information, this clean data that the TUID can help provide, so that we can have an industry that isn't dysfunctional, that isn't siloed and unable to communicate across the simplest of borders, much less country borders. So we're wanting to invite and continue inviting the industry. And I think the TUID is just one of those foundational building blocks that, as we've looked at the big picture, not just a specific go-to-market strategy, but the big picture of the industry, this is what we found as absolutely necessary for digitization to be able to occur.
Right.
So thanks for letting me break in there, Dr. Vic.
Lynn, if I could add something to that, Linda,
Yeah.
This is just talking to Vic yesterday. This is the way I looked at it. I said, you guys built the road along with some guardrails, and you're driving the car, but you're looking for passengers who eventually will drive the car, and you might even get out of the car at some point. And how this evolves over time will be up to those members, not necessarily, you guys are always at the steering wheel.
I was actually just hoping to get into the back seat. I mean, I want someone else to drive. I'm just going to sit back and watch. I like the scenery.
But somebody had to start this process, and that's what you guys have done. Because to your point, Vic, I think you said it perfectly. You can't create that governance steering committee unless you create a steering committee to kind of get the whole process started.
Yeah, and this is, the details of all of this there's so many details that really, I think, requires a podcast all of its own to go into this stuff. I know there are going to be a million questions about how this would work and who will do what to whom, et cetera. And we have answers for a lot of them, but not all. And some of the answers really shouldn't come from us. They should come from the steering committees and the working groups when this thing is actually stood up and fully populated by the key industry stakeholders. When they're running the show is when some of the critical decisions probably should be deferred until they can actually get their hands on it. So, all of that's being discussed and thought about. The point is to create the vehicle for that to happen. And the final piece of this puzzle is it will need to have an operating company to implement certain aspects. And the way this is structured right now is the DFM Data Corp is the operating company. But steering committee is the steering committee. So my thought is, as long as DFM Data Court's doing a great job, that's the way it'll be. If not, then not. So that's the basic process. We've actually built more than just the model. So to give you an idea, we have a formal legal structure that's established. A company with bylaws, with structures and rules and stuff like that, and a specific place for industry equity ownership with full voting rights. There can be different classes of participation and so on, and this is all subject to discussion, but the basic structure is there. We have defined, at least to a fairly deep operational degree, a member-led governance model, what we've just been talking about. We have built a membership management website, control center, that allows for onboarding of people, for voting processes to occur, for documentation to be recorded, that does the mechanics, the parliamentary clerk, if you will, of the process. We built a working data lake and messaging system to allow communications of the type needed to track the TUID or to share information as anonymously and securely as possible. We've built a working prototype of that system. And we have a DFM industry directory where we're assembling the list of all the players, because we want to invite everybody who is a legitimate potential stakeholder. We don't want to miss anybody. So we're building a directory. And out of that, possibly some ideas about things that this information could help people find each other in different contexts. There is actually a lot on the ground in operation that's actually working to support this idea of an organizational ecosystem that would allow for the implementation industry-wide of a TUID system and sharing, and then handing the baton to the industry to take that forward in terms of governance and management. So it's not just an idea. There's a lot of practical stuff that's already in place. And we're pretty much there on all of these, except possibly the industry directory is still a work in process. So we absolutely invite people to come in and ask questions, dig in, talk to us, explore these things. I mean, we do have specific things that we can share and discuss. The last point I would make, and this is really, I think, the real challenge, is if we were to implement something like this, how would you get the industry to adopt it? And looking at other industries where similar kinds of initiatives have taken place, it's never really worked to try to impose it top down. You need to have an incentive that the players in the industry, all the actors, will feel bound to respond to. And the one that's historically worked in almost every other industry effectively is customer pull. Now, we have to create a system, in order to get this to go out, we have to create a system whereby the customer, people paying the bills, the customer could be the shipper and or the recipient or a combination. They have to pull this out of the industry. So the industry really has to do it in response to them. And the way that would work, here are two examples. This could be structured many ways, but here are two that I think are the most likely and may ultimately cover most of the actual activity. The first is we can put the code necessary to create the TUID and the communications and everything else into almost any of the enterprise software that's out there, whether it's a TMS system or SAP, an ERP, Oracle, you name it, WMS systems. any of those would be perfectly functional as a place to house the generation, for a shipper to have the generation of the TUID and the communication of the TUID to all the interested parties. We'd have to get the software industry to agree to add those features to their set, but I could see a shipper configuring their SAP system and a checkbox that says, do you want to generate TUIDs? And then another sets of checkbox that say, who do you want to send it to? And that would be entirely, once that's done, every time a shipper forms a load in their software, a notification would go to the recipient customer that a shipment is intended to go to them. Our thought process is that, I'm going to do, sorry, I just messed myself up a little. The other method is, rather than have enterprise software within the shipper do it, and some shippers don't have those systems, is we create a neutral standalone TUID server that will basically do the same thing as a cloud service. And the idea is that the shipper would send, when they create the TUID, it would be automatically sent to the recipient, and that would give it a certain amount of authentication. So they'd know they were getting a notification from a responsible party. Our hope is that the recipients would then start to ask the carriers, well, which TUID is this load you're pulling in? And if they keep asking the carriers are going to have to ask the DFMs and the brokers. And the DFMs and the brokers are going to have to adjust their systems or their questions to make sure they get that information from the shipper when they're actually doing the original booking. And now we would have a cycle where over time, more and more people would be requested for these. And if enough people are requested, and if this, for example, if a few huge shippers went on board early and a few huge customers went on board early, then it wouldn't take very long before everybody would simply build that into their systems, because it'd be easier to do it for everybody, or at least have the option, than to try to pick and choose who gets that, who do they do it with and not. So the idea is to set up something like this. The key would be to get the endpoints, some influential shippers, some influential customers to agree that this is a good idea, and to offer it and accept it, and then to perhaps gently demand it of the intermediaries in the system. And that's got there's a lot more work that needs to be done on these kinds of ideas, but that would set it up. The places we see right now, DFM Data Corp, as part of its function, as the operating entity, as the operating company, the enabler of the steering committee and the organization, setting up the neutral service would be a reasonable workload or task for DFM Data Corp to perform in that role. Because it's optional. You don't have to, they don't have to use it. It's not mandatory, but it's there as a service that seems to fit with the rest of the services. The second thing is the idea that we would create a member-owned data lake, which would be keep a copy of these, which would then open up the possibilities of doing things like authentication and verification. Is this load real? Have I been notified of a load has it gone through the process? Is there a record of it? Remember, we're only storing the hash. Then maybe down the road, as an industry, decide to add more data in conjunction with the hash. Those are decisions for the industry to take. And that is the end of my story. Questions?
Yeah, I want to say thank you to everyone who has kind of stuck it out through us going past the time frame we initially set. I did put a link into the chat for a follow-on event, because I respect that we're not going to have the time to really do an effective Q&A right now. So if you can just grab that link and register and join us, it'll be in 2 weeks on the 1st. And we'll have Dr. Vic, hopefully Joe will be joining us as well. And we may have a few other people like John Greaves to be facilitating this Q&A. And please feel free. I also put my Calendly in there. Happy to set up individual chats to understand where you're coming from, what you feel the pain points of the industry are, and just make sure that the Q&A is effective for the industry and addresses as many problems and potential issues as we possibly can on the front end. So we mentioned the steering committee as well. That's something that if you go to the link that I dropped for the join button for the DFM data website, you can just register that you're interested in engaging with us in that light as well, and we can have a follow-on conversation. So I appreciate the in-depth overview that you gave. It's hard to say in-depth and overview at the same time, but that's kind of what it is. We're just scratching the surface, but it's such a deep issue, and you really touched some of the very vital points that I think as an industry we have to take into consideration to go into effective digitization. And I appreciate you, Joe, kind of dialing it into to the nuts and bolts of everyday.
I'm all about the shallow end. That's all I do. Drag everyone back to the shallow end.
That's because you know how to swim so well. You can drag us back to the shallow
my
end.
feet on the ground.
But
I love this. I love this idea. I think it's again. I think as soon as it was mentioned to me, it was, well, you mentioned it, and I was like, oh my God, why didn't we? Or why isn't somebody already working on it? And the answer is somebody is.
Yeah, it's been done well in other industries, and we're looking forward to being able to help facilitate it being done well in the freight matching industry as well.
It's really ironic to have to talk for this long and then at the end say, well, this was really intended as a conversation starter.
That's what it is. So I look forward to the follow-up conversation. Thank you all for your engagement, and see you on the 1st, if not before. Ciao.
Or any questions in between.
Absolutely. You have our contact, so let's keep the conversation rolling. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you.